This video seeks to shed some light on the other culprits of the Palestinian displacement, without minimizing Israel's role in the conflict. The population of Palestine in the late 1800s, when the Ottomans took a census, was some 94% Arabs, 3% Jews, and 3% other minorities, including Samaritans. The demographic shift from minority Levantine Arabs to almost entirely Arabic took 11 centuries. But what caused the Jewish population to dwindle? Historians agree that there is no evidence of a massive Arab migration into Palestine, so the Arab growth was organic, a combination of natural births and cultural assimilation of local peoples. We examine what caused the Jews to keep abandoning their homes while the Arab population seemed to thrive. The dhimmi system under Islamic law, the Crusades, the Ottoman land laws, the Zionist movement, and other forces played a significant role in shaping the modern Arab-Israeli relations. The Jewish population was the majority in Syria-Palestine in 632 CE. Although some historians claim that the Jews were slightly outnumbered by Christians by the time the Byzantine Empire fell. A huge decline from the 7th century to the 19th century followed, and then a rapid resurgence in the 20th century. To understand why Jewish immigration to Palestine in the 20th century was so contentious, we must analyze why the Jews practically disappeared from Palestine in the first place. The decline in the Jewish population in Palestine was driven by a combination of political, economic, social, and religious changes. This decline seems to have been gradual and occurred over a long period, spanning numerous Islamic caliphates and dynasties. Contrary to popular belief, there was no Arab invasion or mass migration into Palestine. Not in the aftermath of the Islamic military conquests of the 7th century, or ever. Most Arab Muslims chose to migrate to modern-day Iraq instead but spread as far as North Africa. It is important to note that by the 7th century, the Jewish population had recovered from the lows of the Jewish revolts era, 70 CE to 135 CE. But the Christian population had also grown considerably, especially under Byzantine rule. The following are the key factors contributing to the Jewish population decline. The Arab conquests and Islamic rule, 7th century onwards, meant the Byzantines were replaced by the Muslims in much the same role as the other foreign rulers before them, settler colonialists. The conquests of Palestine by Arab Muslims brought significant changes to the region, including the establishment of Islamic rule. While Jews, as people of the book, were generally allowed to practice their religion under Islamic law, they faced various degrees of social and legal restrictions. People of the book, Christians, Jews, and other monotheistic religions, were generally allowed to continue practicing their religions and maintain their institutions, albeit with the payment of a poll tax, jizya, and subject to certain conditions under the dhimmi system. The term, dhimmi, refers to non-Muslim citizens in an Islamic state, who were granted protected status in exchange for meeting certain obligations. The specific conditions could vary over time and place, but some common aspects included diminished legal and social status. Dhimmis were generally considered second-class citizens. They had certain protections under Islamic law, but were subject to a number of legal and social impediments. Non-Muslims were granted autonomy in religious affairs. Dhimmis were typically allowed to govern their own communities in matters of religion and personal status law, such as marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Restrictions were imposed on public worship. In many cases, dhimmis were not allowed to openly preach or evangelize, or build new places of worship that overshadowed Islamic structures. Maintenance and repair of existing religious buildings was subject to limitations. Dress and identification codes were imposed. Dhimmis were often required to adhere to specific dress codes, or to wear distinctive markers to differentiate them from Muslims. But this varied over time, place, and ruling authority. Exemption from military service. Dhimmis were usually exempted from military service, which was one of the justifications for the jizya tax. In return, the Islamic State was supposed to ensure their protection and security. In Islamic courts, the testimony of a dhimmi against a Muslim was typically not accepted, which could result in inequalities and injustices in legal matters. Land and property disputes would just be resolved in the Muslim party's favor. Dhimmis sometimes faced barriers to property ownership and certain economic activities. Despite this, they still contributed significantly to the economic and cultural life of Islamic societies. Non-Muslims were prohibited from public office. Dhimmis were often barred from holding certain public offices, particularly those involving authority over Muslims. Dhimmis were expected to respect Islamic sensibilities, such as not displaying religious symbols in a provocative manner, or offending Muslim morals and beliefs. In some periods and regions, dhimmis experienced relative tolerance and prosperity, while in others they faced more severe restrictions and persecutions. The dhimmi system reflected the difficulties of religious and cultural coexistence in historical Islamic societies. Jews faced economic and social challenges under the various Islamic dynasties. The Jewish community faced harder economic challenges, including heavy taxation and legal obstacles. The heavy taxation on agricultural lands forced many to move to the cities. But they realized conditions weren't that much better there either. These economic difficulties likely contributed to emigration and a decline in population growth. The social structures of Jewish communities broke down. Crusades, 11th to 13th centuries, were driven by a misguided notion of holy war. In response to Islamic jihad, the Christian popes sought to stop the spread of Islam, but with familiar Western imperialist undertones. The Crusades had a devastating impact on the Jewish communities in Palestine, even though Muslims were their primary targets. Because there was no mass migration into Palestine by Arab Muslims, the population actually remained majority Christian until the 12th century. Jews faced massacres and destruction, particularly during the initial capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099. The Crusaders were anti-Islam and anti-Semitic, and they attacked both Jews and Muslims with the goal of regaining control of the Holy Land. This period of violence and upheaval led to a significant reduction in the Jewish population. The Crusaders gave the Jews two choices: convert to Christianity, or die. A lot chose death. The defeat of the Crusaders paved the way for the revival of the Islamization of Palestine. However, in the battle to recapture Jerusalem, the Muslim caliphs dismantled the city wall. This led to further destruction and population decline, which continued well after the Crusades. And this time the Christian population also suffered big losses. It is estimated that the Christian population declined from 50% at the beginning of the Crusades to about 10% at the end. A remarkable transformation, that even with no migration and with war losses of their own. The Arab population soon emerged as the majority population in Palestine. Mamluk Sultanate and Ottoman Empire then rose up, defeating the Arab caliphs. Under the Mamluks, 13th to 16th centuries, and later the Ottomans, 16th to 20th centuries, Palestine saw periods of neglect and economic decline. The region became a backwater province, characterized by economic stagnation and isolation, which, when combined with occasional outbreaks of plague and local conflicts, negatively impacted the population as a whole. Restrictions and persecutions were ongoing. Throughout these centuries, Jewish communities sometimes faced persecution, forced conversions, and expulsion. There is no evidence to suggest that the Jews abandoned their homesteads en masse by choice. These events, though not constant, contributed to the decline and displacement of the Jewish population. The region also experienced several natural disasters and epidemics over the centuries, which affected all its inhabitants. Such events could disproportionately impact smaller communities. Jews had to migrate for religious and economic reasons. Throughout the medieval and Ottoman periods, some Jews emigrated from Palestine seeking religious freedom and better economic opportunities, as a result of their struggles under Muslim rule. This included migration to Europe and other parts of the Middle East, where they also faced persecution. The emigration of Jews out of Palestine. Intermarriages, linguistic and cultural assimilation of pagans, Christians and Samaritans, inevitably resulted in a cumulatively significant demographic shift over time, in favor of Arab Muslims. While there are no reliable historical records, most historians agree that the growth of the Arab population in Palestine was not due to migration, but mostly due to a combination of natural births and cultural assimilation. Let us rewind back to the 7th century. The conquering Islamic militants begrudgingly converted to Islam the local Levantine Arab tribes, even though they had previously fought against the Prophet Muhammad's forces alongside the Byzantines, and they conscripted them into their garrisons. This, in order to help with the administration of the territory. Having established administration centers in pre-existing settlements, rather than building new ones, they instituted Islamic law. and started imposing and collecting taxes from the local non-Muslim inhabitants, the dhimmis. Religious conversion of dhimmis was initially not a priority. It was not until after the Crusades ended that Islam entered an era of dominance in Palestine. The Arabization and Islamization of Palestine was very gradual, and did not take full effect until the 12th century. It was at this time that the dominant language transitioned from bilingual Palestinian or Levantine Arabic and Aramaic to mostly Arabic, and Islam became the predominant religion of Palestine. Enter the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement, late 19th century, was created as a Jewish nationalist movement by Theodor Herzl, and was based in Eastern and Central Europe. The movement aimed to re-establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, in the region roughly corresponding with the historical kingdoms of Israel and Judea. This movement was partly a response to the declining conditions of Jews in the region, and in Europe, due to rising anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, the hostility toward or discrimination against Jews, predates Zionism by many centuries. One of the most notorious episodes of anti-Semitism was the Rhineland massacres of 1096, during the First Crusade. 8 centuries before the founding of Zionism, Crusaders attacked Jewish communities in the Rhineland, in modern-day Germany, leading to the deaths of thousands of Jews. These massacres are often considered the first major outbreak of anti-Jewish violence in medieval Europe. Zionist activism led to increased Jewish immigration to Palestine. This started in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reversing the long-term decline. Ottoman census taken in the late 19th century indicate the Jews made up only 3% of the population, perhaps the lowest percentage on record. The dhimmi system continued under Ottoman rule as it had under Arab rule, for the Turks were Islamic converts. However, during the 19th century, with the empire in certain decline, the Ottomans instituted some major reforms. The Ottoman land codes of 1858 had significant implications for both Muslim and non-Muslim populations in Palestine, impacting land ownership, agricultural practices, and social structures. This law was part of a series of reforms, known as the Tanzimat, aimed at modernizing the Ottoman Empire and consolidating central control over its territories, including Palestine. The impact on Muslim populations was immediate. Land registration rules were introduced. The law required all landowners to officially register their lands with the state. Many Muslim peasants, who traditionally worked the land under informal arrangements, were either unaware of this requirement or reluctant to engage with the Ottoman-instituted bureaucratic process. There were a number of possible reasons for this. Among them, the high cost of registration, the perceived difficulty of the process, the desire to remain off the central registry to avoid military conscription, and the desire to avoid paying taxes. Some may have believed that the customary communal land tenure laws were adequate for their purposes, but that was no longer the case. As a result, much of the land they cultivated was registered in the names of local notables or urban elites, effectively dispossessing many peasant families. The Ottomans increased taxation. Registered land was subject to taxation. An Islamic kharaj, or land tax, was already in place, applicable to all landowners regardless of religion, but it was not effectively administered. The new law was intended to increase state revenue, but it often placed a heavy burden on Muslim peasants, who either owned land or worked as tenants. The taxation system sometimes led to the sale of land to cover tax debts, further eroding the landholdings of the Muslim peasantry. The changes in land ownership patterns were significant. The law facilitated the accumulation of large estates by urban notables and absentee landlords, who often registered entire communities in their own name, exploiting the collective land tenure customs. Without any cadastral survey, the land was often misregistered, recorded in other than its rightful owner's name, and lawsuits concerning boundaries and legal ownership would later become very common. This shift in land ownership patterns led to a decline in the traditional communal land use system, and contributed to a growing class of landless peasants. The impact on non-Muslim populations was also significant, but in some ways unique. The laws created opportunities for land acquisition for anyone who could afford to do so. For non-Muslims, particularly the Jewish communities interested in establishing a presence in Palestine, the law provided a legal framework for purchasing land. The registration process made it easier for foreign and non-Muslim buyers to acquire land. which was pivotal for the Zionist movement's land purchases in later years. This created apparent social and economic shifts. Christians and other minorities, like their Muslim counterparts, also faced challenges with the new laws. Small landholders or tenants were similarly affected by the centralization of land ownership and the increased tax burden. However, the Jewish communities often had access to external funding from Zionist organizations, which helped them navigate these challenges more effectively. Community relations suffered. The changing land ownership patterns effected by the law also influenced relations between Muslim and non-Muslim communities. The growing presence of Jewish landowners and the displacement of Muslim peasants contributed to social tensions in the region. The estates that were registered in the names of notable individuals and absentee landlords were later sold to Jews, who would eventually evict the Muslim tenants despite prolonged court battles. In general, all land that was not registered by individuals or religious and other entities, hence not accruing tax revenue, just ended up being claimed as state land, and was owned first by the Ottomans, then transferred to the British under the Mandate, and finally to Israelis on the birth of the State of Israel. The Ottoman Land Law of 1858 had a huge impact on both Muslim and non-Muslim communities, with long-term consequences for land ownership, economic structures, and intercommunal relations in the region. The Ottomans inadvertently set in motion the catastrophic loss of land by the Muslim community. British reforms during the Mandate did nothing to change the trajectory. Riots and armed confrontations would sporadically erupt between Jews and Arabs, primarily over land and historical sites. In April 1920, riots erupted during the Nebi Musa festival in Jerusalem. Arab residents expressed their frustration over perceived Jewish immigration and British support for Zionism. This event resulted in several deaths and injuries and marked one of the early clashes in the region. 1929 Hebron Massacre. In August 1929, tensions flared up in Hebron, after rumors spread that Jews were planning to take control of the Western Wall in Jerusalem. Arab residents attacked their Jewish neighbors, resulting in a brutal massacre. This event led to the evacuation of the Jewish community from Hebron. A more extended period of conflict, known as the Arab Revolt, began in 1936, lasting until 1939. Arab Palestinians protested against British policies and Jewish immigration, demanding an end to both. The revolt saw extensive violence, sabotage, and British military intervention. It also prompted the British to limit Jewish immigration, further affecting the Jewish-Arab demographic balance. However, the British did at least do land surveys and proper mapping to avoid new land boundary disputes. The Zionists capitalized on the opportunity to acquire large tracts of land, then built massive Jewish national institutions on it. They later started encouraging Jewish immigrants to settle in Palestine, much to the chagrin of the land's former owners. The turbulent period of the British Mandate in Palestine saw increasingly violent scuffles, riots, and conflicts between Arabs and Jews. Multiple events, covering centuries, shaped the demographics of Palestine, sowing seeds of distrust. Peoples who had lived together, or at least tolerated one another for centuries, sharing land that has been continuously occupied by foreigners. At least 10 different imperial rulers over time took up arms against the other. The effects of Ottoman land laws were a huge factor in causing the Palestinian displacement. The Zionists were the fortuitous beneficiaries. Certain laws enacted after 1948 and other legal maneuvers by the State of Israel as a sovereign nation, primarily the absentee property law of 1950, only exacerbated the inequities created under the Ottoman laws, and made it more difficult for Palestinians to prove and regain ownership of their land. We will explore these issues in another video. The historical context of the Israel-Palestine conflict may seem unimportant at this juncture, but understanding how we got to this point may help in devising a lasting solution, and in empathizing with the viewpoints of either party. It's just that every time one digs deeper into any aspect, it only reveals more complexities, and uncovers more parties complicit in the origin of the conflict. The list of entities that failed the Palestinian people never seems to end. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe for more informative content such as this.